a sleeping town of prosaic virtues and universal hospitality. That's how the novelist Joseph Conrad describes Geneva in his 1911 book Under Western Eyes. It's really damning the city with faint praise. Universal hospitality sounds good, but who wants prosaic virtues and a sleeping town? Conrad visited Geneva several times for spa treatments at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, but at the time, if it might have been sleeping, it was still a hotbed of Russian revolutionaries. On this episode of A Book, A Place, Geneva, we follow the footsteps of Conrad and of the characters in his novel Under Western Eyes and discover why Geneva played such an important role in the history of Russia and of the rest of Europe. And we visit the private library where Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik revolutionaries and founder of the Soviet Union, studied, wrote and literally left his mark. Welcome to A Book, A Place, Geneva, Episode 4, Conrad, Lenin and Revolutionary Geneva. Those damn tram tracks that pull cyclists down. One bike racing along at full speed gets a wheel stuck in the steel trap and sends its rider flying. The fate of Russia would not have been the same if Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, had been killed that day in October 1903 in Geneva. I'm translating from an article in the Tribune de Genève, Geneva's newspaper, called Playing Hide and Seek with Lenin, where they try to retrace the steps of the Russian revolutionary here in Geneva. And I'm reading it outside, number 2 Rue de Candolle. I'm just on the edge of the beautiful Parc des Bastions, just off Place de Neuve, one of the main squares on the left bank of Geneva. And I'm in the university quarter. It's a Sunday, it's the summer, there's no students around. But I'm outside number 2, and it's just called Bâtiment de Candolle. Philosophy, I'm reading, linguistics, Department of Sciences of Antiquity. That's all there is here. It looks like this building was probably put up in the 1960s. But if you were here at that time when Lenin's bicycle got trapped in the steel trap of a tram track, it was because he was coming here on his way on the bike, because here stood a cafe just across the road from much older university buildings. The cafe was called the Brasserie Landolt, and it was famous as the meeting place for Russian revolutionaries. Geneva was one of the first cities in the world to build electric tramways in the late 1800s, and trams play a significant role in the book this episode is about, Under Western Eyes by Joseph Conrad. I certainly won't give that spoiler away. I can't promise to give no spoilers away, but I'll do my best. Published in 1911, it's the story of Russian revolutionaries living in exile in Geneva. Joseph Conrad was born in the Russian Empire to Polish parents who wanted Poland to become independent from Tsarist Russia. Before becoming a writer, amazingly in English, a language he learned in his 20s, Conrad travelled the world as a merchant sailor, including on a steamer on the Congo, which inspired him to write his best-known work, Heart of Darkness, which was in turn the inspiration for the classic Vietnam War movie, Apocalypse Now. Under Western Eyes is set at a time when Conrad, like Lenin, lived in Geneva temporarily. There's no evidence the two ever met, but Conrad stayed for hydrotherapy, for spa treatment, in a neighbourhood where there was a large community of Russian emigrés. As we'll hear later in the episode, Geneva has always been a magnet for people fleeing oppression or with thoughts that are deemed undesirable by the governments of where they're living. Lenin came here, which has already had lots of Russians studying here at the university where I'm standing. Many of them were studying medicine and science, but in the Café Landolt, which is no longer here, but is now a university building, they were studying revolution. We'll come back to the streets of Geneva in a moment, but let's dip into the book Under Western Eyes, which begins not in Switzerland, but in Russia. On a cold, snowy winter's night in St. Petersburg, there is an act of political violence, a bomb attack against a senior government minister, a despotic character named only as Mr. de P. Mr. de P was being driven towards the railway station in a 2-horse uncovered sleigh with footman and coachman on the box. Snow had been falling all night, making the roadway uncleared as yet at this early hour. very heavy for the horses. It was still falling thickly, but the sleigh must have been observed and marked down. As it drew over to the left before taking a turn, the footman noticed a peasant walking slowly on the edge of the pavement with his hands in the pockets of his sheepskin coat and his shoulders hunched up to his ears under the falling snow. On being overtaken, this peasant suddenly faced about and swung his arm. In an instant there was a terrible shock, a detonation muffled in the multitude of snowflakes. Both horses lay dead and mangled on the ground, and the coachman, with a shrill cry, had fallen off the box, mortally wounded. The footman, who survived, had no time to see the face of the man in the sheepskin coat. After throwing the bomb, this last got away, but it is supposed that, seeing a lot of people surging up on all sides of him in the falling snow, and all running towards the scene of the explosion, he thought it safer to turn back with them. In an incredibly short time, an excited crowd assembled around the sledge. The minister-president, getting out unhurt into the deep snow, stood near the groaning coachman and addressed the people repeatedly in his weak, colourless voice. "I beg of you to keep off. For the love of God, I beg of you, good people, to keep off." It was then that a tall young man, who had remained standing perfectly still within a carriage gateway, 2 houses lower down, stepped out into the street and, walking up rapidly, flung another bomb over the heads of the crowd. It actually struck the minister-president on the shoulder as he stooped over his dying servant, then, falling between his feet, exploded with a terrific concentrated violence, striking him dead to the ground, finishing the wounded man, and practically annihilating the empty sledge in the twinkling of an eye. With a yell of horror, the crowd broke up and fled in all directions, except for those who fell dead or dying where they stood nearest to the minister-president, and 1 or 2 others who did not fall till they had run a little way. The first explosion had brought together a crowd as if by enchantment. The second made as swiftly a solitude in the street for hundreds of yards in each direction. Through the falling snow, people looked from afar at the small heap of dead bodies lying upon each other near the carcasses of the 2 horses. So the bomber somehow makes his escape and next appears in the student lodgings of the protagonist, Kirilo Sirodovich Razumov, a serious young man who keeps himself to himself, and the arrival of this radical, a fellow student called Haldin, will have an impact on Razumov almost as devastating as that of that bomb going off. Moments before that meeting though, Razumov's just a normal student. That day, Mr. Razumov got up at his usual hour and spent the morning within the university buildings, listening to the lectures and working for some time in the library. He heard the first vague rumour of something in the way of bomb throwing at the table of the students' ordinary, where he was accustomed to eat his 2 o'clock dinner. But this rumour was made up of mere whispers, and this was Russia, where it is not always safe for a student, especially, to appear too much interested in certain kinds of whispers. Razumov was one of those men who, living in a period of mental and political unrest, keep an instinctive hold on normal, practical, everyday life. He was aware of the emotional tension of his time. He even responded to it in an indefinite way. But his main concern was with his work, his studies, and with his own future. But that future is thrown into disarray when Haldin shows up at Razumov's lodgings and confesses to the bombing, immediately implicating Razumov in the revolutionary plot and leaving him speechless. This is Haldin explaining his motivation, with justifications for violence perhaps not that far from those of Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries that Joseph Conrad may have come across in Geneva. "You say nothing, Kirilo Sirodovich. I understand your silence. To be sure, I cannot expect you with your frigid English manner to embrace me, but never mind your manners. You have enough heart to have heard the sound of weeping and gnashing of teeth this man raised in the land. He had to be stopped. He was uprooting the tender plant. He had to be stopped. He was a dangerous man, a convinced man. 3 more years of his work would have put us back 50 years into bondage. And look at all the lives wasted, at all the souls lost in that time." His curt, self-confident voice suddenly lost its ring, and it was in a dull tone that he added, "Yes, brother, I have killed him. It's weary work." Razumov had sunk into a chair. Every moment he expected a crowd of policemen to rush in. There must have been thousands of them out looking for that man walking up and down in his room. Yes, Razumov, yes, brother, someday you shall help to build. You suppose that I am a terrorist now, a destructor of what is. But consider that the true destroyers are they who destroy the spirit of progress and truth, not the avengers who merely kill the bodies of the persecutors of human dignity. Men like me are necessary to make room for self-contained thinking men like you. Don't make a mistake, Razumov. This is not murder. It is war. War! My spirit shall go on warring in some Russian body till all falsehood is swept out of the world. The modern civilization is false, but a new revelation shall come out of Russia. Ha! You say nothing. You're a skeptic. I respect your philosophical skepticism, Razumov. But don't touch the soul. The Russian soul that lives in all of us. It has a future. It has a mission, I tell you. Or else why should I have been moved to do this? Reckless, like a butcher, in the middle of all these innocent people, scattering death. I wouldn't hurt a fly. Not so loud, warned Razumov harshly. Joseph Conrad stayed 4 times in this house: 1891, 1894, 1895, 1907. That's the plaque that's on the front of this building. It's like a 4-story house, number 25 Avenue de la Roseraie. Now, this is just very close to the river Arve. Across from there is the quarter known as Carouge. I believe this is just inside the quarter known as Champel. And back in Conrad's day, he came here to take the waters. I'll read an excerpt from the introduction from the Penguin Classics that talks about it. Under Western Eyes opens in St. Petersburg and then moves to Geneva, a city Conrad visited 4 times for hydrotherapy, then a popular cure for nervous illness. His first stay in 1891 occurred in the wake of his experience in the Congo, and his last with his family in 1907. On each occasion, Conrad stayed at Champel-les-Bains at the city's outer edge, half an hour from the centre and situated on the river Arve. The Hôtel Pension de la Roseraie was ideally located for baths at the hydrotherapy establishment across the road. But Conrad got to know the whole city well. Now, across the road is a very modern-looking residential block. There's no spa treatments around here as far as I know. I'll carry on reading the introduction from the Penguin. When the Genevese erected a plaque to commemorate Conrad's 4 visits, they included the inscription Geneva despecta suc sapiens, which Penguin translates as Geneva is scorned, giving shelter, which is very interesting because in the book Under Western Eyes it talks a lot about how it's a city of refuge, but also how aloof and uncaring Geneva is in the eyes of the protagonist Razumov. I'll read this one last bit from the introduction from the Penguin book. Neutral and democratic Switzerland offers an ironic setting for this drama of Russian autocracy, revolution, and tortured emotion. Landlocked, small and provincial, behind its natural alpine barrier in Central Europe, the country, the very watchword of political compromise in its founding, offers a symbolic space where this drama can be acted out for the inspection of the narrators and the readers' Western eyes. To the Russian exiles in Under Western Eyes, the city is indifferent and hospitable in its cold, almost scornful toleration, a respectable town of refuge to which all these sorrows and hopes were nothing. And that's a quote from the book itself. I've just crossed the river into Carouge, the neighbourhood that the Tribune de Genève said was called Karoujska because it was such a hotbed of Russian revolutionaries back in Lenin and Conrad's day. And I'm at an address which is Rue de la Tannerie number 2 or 2 bis, 2B. It seems to be official offices of the Genevan government right now. But if I walk down this little alleyway, I see a plaque on the wall. And it says Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, born in 1870, died 1924, Russian revolutionary statesman, lived in this house between May and June 1903. So imagine you're here. Imagine yourself as Lenin, the revolutionary, or as Conrad, the writer who's adopted England as his home country, even though he grew up speaking Polish in the Russian Empire. Neither of them would have had any idea in, let's say, 1908, when this book was starting to be written, that Europe was about to be transformed by the Great War of 1914 to 1918, the war we now call the First World War. Neither Conrad nor Lenin would have known that war was coming. It would rip the continent apart, and it would also provide the opportunity for Russian revolutionaries like Lenin to overthrow the Tsar in the revolution of 1917 while the war was still going on. And that's why, for me, Under Western Eyes is such a fascinating book. It's a discussion of the Russian Revolution before it's even happened. The book begins in St. Petersburg, then the capital of Russia, later and temporarily known as Leningrad. Without giving too much away, the events of Under Western Eyes take Razumov to Geneva and this hotbed of revolutionary activity. It's such a Genevan book that the Penguin Classics edition includes a map of the city, charting the places mentioned in it. Razumov comes to Geneva in a state of turmoil. His implication in the bombing in St. Petersburg has robbed him of his future as a promising student, and the Tsarist regime has pressured him to come to Geneva to live among the radicals he despises. To get a better idea of the Russian emigré scene portrayed in the book Under Western Eyes, I met up with Serge Hazanov, a Russian writer who has lived in Geneva for 40 years and studied the history of revolutionaries in Switzerland. His book, Red Papers, will be published soon in the US. I arranged to meet Serge in one of the many locations brought to life in Under Western Eyes, on an island in the middle of the Rhone River. I'm sitting on an island in the Rhone River. Well, to my left is the Mont Blanc Bridge, the main bridge connecting the two sides of the city of Geneva. And the other side of that bridge is Lake Geneva. And this is the point where it flows out into the Rhone and then out into France and down to the Mediterranean Sea. And on this island, it's called Rousseau Island because over there I'm looking now is a statue of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was born in Geneva. He was an Enlightenment writer, but that's not the subject of this episode. The subject of this episode is Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And I wanted to meet someone who could tell me something about the Russian émigrés who lived here that Conrad writes about in this fictional work. So I'm sitting under a horse chestnut tree in the shade with Serge Hazanov. Hi Serge, how are you?
Happy to sit with you and to participate in your podcast.
Now, what is your interest and why do you have a knowledge about this period of Russian history?
Since the end of the 19th century, there were many Russian revolutionaries that were exiled in Europe. Switzerland was particular because it has a long-day tradition of a refuge country starting when it accepted Protestants from France. So many revolutions came here, and also it was very calm and politically stable situation contrary to Germany and France. So this was one of the reasons. So Lenin first came to Geneva to meet George Plekhanov. George Plekhanov was the godfather of Russian Marxists. He lived in Geneva since 1890. Lenin came to Geneva at the end of the 19th century after his exile in Siberia, and here in 1900 he founded in Geneva his daily paper Iskra, Spark. There was a famous Congress of Russian Social Democrats that was being held in London in 1903. But before this Congress, many delegates came to Geneva to speak with Lenin, who was at the time in the center of the revolutionary activities. Right. And they met at the Café Landolt, famous Café Landolt, Rue de Candolle, which now doesn't exist, sadly. Leon Trotsky, took part in these meetings. The cafe was definitely closed in 1999, and sadly there was a famous wooden table on which Lenin graved his name, and this table disappeared.
Yes, I've read about this table. I'll put a link to it in the show notes of the episode. The local newspaper here, there's a whole mystery as to what happened to this table, because before you could go and see Lenin's writing on it, but it was also scrawled with thousands of other names as well, where people had gone. In that cafe then, there would be meetings of revolutionary thinkers, but also there was, as I understand it, different factions already. Even within that cafe, there would be factions that wouldn't meet. Can you tell us something about the different factions?
Right. The problem is that at the beginning all the Russian Social Democrats were together, and their godfather, as I told you, was Plekhanov. But very soon different leaders like Lenin, Trotsky, Martov had different ideas. They founded different fractions, and there were very hot discussions at this cafe. And sadly, after the London Congress, different sections went in different directions, and this is how the two famous fractions, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, appeared. Bolsheviks means the majority, Mensheviks means the minority. Mensheviks were guided by Martov, Bolsheviks were guided by Lenin, because they were more radical, while Martov was more liberal, so he didn't want to apply violent measures, revolutionary measures. But the discussions were mainly in this Café Landaulet. Then Lenin very soon established his headquarters at 9193 Rue Candole, again at the university, and there was a party library with a lot of books and magazines, right? And there was printing shops for the newspapers Spark and later Forward. There was a library, and there was a canteen for 100 places visited by all the Russian colony. And the Russian colony at the time of the Geneva was around 2,000 people. These were not only revolutionary exiles, but a lot of Russian students studying at Geneva University, and they were certainly interested by the discussions in the Café Landaulet and by the activities in this Russian Lenin's headquarters center.
So this is referred to very vaguely in Conrad's book, and Conrad lived here. I assume would have come across some of the Russians here, be they students, be they revolutionaries. I'm going to read you, Serge, just a passage to explain why on earth we're sitting here. If that cafe was still in existence, we would be there drinking a coffee, but it's not. So we're sitting here because the anti-hero of this book is a man called Razumov, and I don't want to give too much of the story away, but let's put it like this. He wasn't involved in an assassination plot in St. Petersburg, but he gets involved in it by accident. He has no interest in revolutionary thought. He actually hates the revolutionaries, and for various reasons he's in a state of absolute turmoil as he comes to Geneva. And we follow him walking around. So if you're visiting Geneva, the Parc des Bastions, the University Quarter, and this also, Serge, the post office building, which is just over this enormous building, just quite close to the main station here. It's just been completed when this book is set, and it looks like some kind of ancient building now. But here we meet, on page 239, we meet Razumov, who's strolling in a state of quite a lot of existential angst the streets of Geneva. He had unconsciously turned to the left once more, and now was aware of being on a bridge again. This one was much narrower than the other, and instead of being straight, made a sort of elbow or angle. At the point of that angle, a short arm joined it to a hexagonal islet, with a soil of gravel, and its shores faced with dressed stone, a perfection of puerile neatness. A couple of tall poplars and a few other trees stood grouped on the clean dark gravel, and under them a few garden benches, and a bronze effigy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, seated on a pedestal. If solitude could ever be secured on the open air in the middle of a town, he would have it there on this absurd island. It's interesting, he calls this island absurd. He's quite an unpleasant character, Razumov, and he doesn't like Geneva, and he doesn't really like anyone or anything, but he very often refers to Geneva in terms of, let me find another couple of mentions of it, the sleeping town of prosaic virtues. Serge, you mentioned that Geneva was a place for hundreds of years of refuge for Protestant refugees. There was this kind of tolerance for dissidents, even though they probably, the thoughts of Lenin and his cohorts would probably not be welcome, particularly in Switzerland and in Geneva. It was tolerated because there was this feeling of free thought. But in Conrad's book, Razumov is quite scornful. At one point, page 279, he mentions, outside there was only the night sky harbouring a thundercloud, and the town indifferent and hospitable in its cold, almost scornful toleration. A respectable town of refuge to which all these sorrows and hopes were nothing. It's quite a cynical view of the position of Geneva as this welcoming place of refuge. So anyway, that was just to explain to you why we're sitting on Rousseau Island. Rousseau, of course, also a great thinker who had ideas of, if not revolutionary change, a very great social change in books like The Social Contract. So he was from here, and actually he left Geneva. It's interesting that he sets this point of Razumov staring into these waters as they flow out of Lake Geneva.
It's a very interesting question, because just here it's a very particular question, as the same as question of happiness, which very subjective. The same is viewpoint of famous Russian travelers on Geneva. Lenin in particular loved Geneva. He wrote to his sister that for him it was the best place of exile, possibility to work in calm, etc. But it was not unanimous. For example, Dostoevsky, who in 1857 made his wedding travel into Geneva, he hated the city because of the climate. He felt very bad in this climate, and also because of the people. He called it, I'm citing, a city of boring drunkards. Right. Then certainly Gogol also was bored by the Swiss and Geneva paysage, and especially I must cite a classical work of Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy. He has a very famous classical novel, Lucerna, where he criticizes the mindset of burghers, which was governing at the time in Switzerland. It was mid-19th century, so he was quite negative. So it's very particular, you see, from people.
I love that phrase, was it a city of boring drunks? Which is like
drunkards.
I mean, exciting, interesting drunkards was probably what you would find in the Café Landalt, right?
Absolutely.
And you're Russian, right? But you've been here a long time, so you must understand the Russian mentality and the Genevan mentality. Quite different, I would guess, right?
When the empire disappeared, Russian immigrants went to, in particular, to Switzerland. The best place to go to was Zurich, certainly, because all the financial capitals are there, and the work, etc. But Russians, because of their mentality, preferred French part, Geneva, because in Zurich everything is so well punctual, clean. So for them it was difficult to breathe. Here it is more French spirit. You can live and breathe and get and let others live. You see, so the Russians preferred this, though there were very few jobs here.
We still feel that today as well, I think, the difference between Zurich and Geneva. And also I think the attraction of Geneva, even back in the mid-1800s, long before Lenin's time, was also the language, French, which any educated Russian would be able to speak, right?
And you know why? Because after the Great French Revolution, the majority of French aristocrats, the nobles, went to Russia. And there, those of them who didn't have money had to earn their life by working as governors teaching to children. So French was really the second or maybe the first language in Russia. And what you can notice if you open War and Peace by Tolstoy, many pages are in French. So it was cultural and historical.
So there's been a transfer of kind of emigres, both revolutionaries and also the victims of those revolutions, the French aristocrats, and then presumably Russian aristocrats or wealthy Russians after the Russian Revolution coming here. So there would have been in this Russian community revolutionaries and bourgeois or aristocrats as well. There's also famously the Golden Church on the hill over here. What do you know about the Russian church? I've only passed it 100 times.
It's a very old church which was independent certainly of the Russian patriarchy in Russia, especially after the revolution, because it objected to many measures that Bolsheviks imposed on the official church. And there is one more very interesting question I want to mention: why this Russian colony was so numerous. The problem is that a great deal of the Russian colony were the students of the university. Who were the students? The problem is that in the Russian universities, Jews were not accepted, and women also. So many Jews, especially women, who had a bit of means, they went abroad. At that time, Swiss universities, firstly Zurich University, but Tsar was afraid of Zurich because it was too revolutionary. So they moved to Lausanne and Geneva, which were young universities, needing funding payment. They accepted foreigners, absolutely welcomed, and there was a great community in Lausanne and in Geneva. Mainly they studied sciences and medicine.
What you mentioned there of women coming to study here, Russian women and Jewish men and women coming, is covered very well in the podcast Que tombe le Tsar. It's in French. The Tsar Must Fall. I'll put links to it in the show notes. So it goes back many decades before Lenin's arrival here. They're putting up, Serge, we're sitting at the cafe, which is also mentioned actually in Conrad's book, but they're putting out tables. It's getting a bit noisy. I suggest we move a little way. And actually, if you don't mind, could we stroll over to Place Mollard, just over there?
Absolutely, we'll speak about
There's something I want to show you.
I know this.
Okay, all right, we'll go and look at that thing over there.
Right.
Okay, I'll switch this off and we'll pick it back up. I hopped on my bike and Serge on his scooter, back to the left bank into a major shopping thoroughfare. So here we are. I cycled, you've scooted 2 or 3 minutes over to Place du Mollard, and we're looking at a little squat medieval looking tower, and there's this very interesting carving on it, and it's written above it Genève cité de refuge, Geneva city of refuge, and there are 2 figures on it. One seems to be kind of an angel figure holding a shield with that's the symbol of Geneva, with a hand above a figure who's in repose. And what do you make of that figure lying down there, Serge?
It is like Geneva welcomes the people who are persecuted.
Right.
But in the second figure person who is welcomed, many people find a great resemblance with Vladimir Lenin. You see, we can't state it for sure how it is done. This bas-relief was finished in 1920. So it's quite possible that the artists wanted, maybe seriously or ironically, to paint Lenin, because at this time he was at the center of the world attention.
I'll put a photo for this on the show notes or in the YouTube version of this podcast. But for me, my God, if you were to ask me which global figure is that, there's no doubt about it. That's the bald pate and stern look of Lenin there. I think the artist who made this thing, as you say, after the Russian Revolution, denied it was Lenin, said it was just a coincidence. But, maybe it wouldn't have been a popular thing in 1920s in Western Europe.
Was still civil war.
Right,
in Russia, so
still civil war.
Yes.
A controversial figure then as now to be celebrated. You mentioned irony.
Yes, maybe, because when Herbert Wells, the great British writer...
The Herbert Wells Serge refers to here is better known as H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer of books such as The War of the Worlds.
When Herbert Wells visited Lenin in 1920 in Kremlin, and Lenin told him things, a bit brave things, that in 10 years all Soviet people will live in prosperity, something. Herbert Wells, who was writing about future, he called him Kremlin dreamer. I want to mention one more interesting thing about Lenin that we didn't speak yet. In 1904, there was a meeting here in Geneva of all the so-called communist social settlers to honor the memory of the famous Paris Commune of 1871. In this meeting, Lenin was a speaker. But there was another famous speaker at this meeting. Who was it? Benito Mussolini, who at the time was a socialist. And it's very interesting what these two people could discuss together. As we say, that is the question.
Wow. So Benito Mussolini met Lenin here in Geneva.
Yes, in this meeting.
I wonder what language they spoke as well.
Lenin was from a noble family.
Right.
He spoke German, French, English, don't forget.
Did he speak Italian?
Maybe, yes.
Because I remember reading that when Mussolini met Hitler, he was such an egotist that he refused to have a translator. And he pretended he could speak German, right. But he couldn't. So maybe, I don't know, probably, yes, with a mixture of French and German, maybe they could manage it.
Anyway, they met for sure.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. To find this place, we're standing looking out again at the bridge, Mont Blanc, the main bridge, going over the River Rhône and the lake. This Café de la Lacustre, it's just there. And at the moment, because it's summer 2025, next to it is this enormous white football for the women's European Championships. So it's a pretty prominent, although a fairly subtle, probably people walk past this without looking at it. It couldn't be more central, really, this maybe tribute to Lenin, but not, according to the official version.
But anyway, these places were marked by him because Lenin, when in Geneva, he worked regularly at the university library, the public library, and especially at the library of the Société de Lecture. So he liked it there because there were no people. He could be calm, alone, and take any books. So and his traces are still marked there. You can find that through his traces.
You can't see his traces on that table from the cafe anymore.
No, sadly.
But if you're lucky enough to be allowed to see the books where he made his marks in the margin, he's left them there. And you know what? I was lucky enough. If you stroll up from Place Mollard into the old town of Geneva, you'll come across the place that Serge mentions, the Société de Lecture, the Reading Society, a cultural gem in Geneva. It's still a private library with a wonderful collection and reading rooms, and it hosts writers from around the world to give talks. You actually heard a couple of those writers who had given talks there in previous episodes of A Book of Place Geneva. I went there and found locked away in an air-conditioned vault a unique archive. I met Manuel Bouvier, the Society's president, who before showing me that archive told me some of the library's history, which is also itself connected to Geneva's wider history as a place of refuge. So I'm sitting in the Société de Lecture with Manuel Bouvier. Manuel, thanks for inviting me here. I've discovered the Société de Lecture while researching and recording for this podcast. But if someone's never heard of it, could you tell us what it is?
It's in the center of the old town of Geneva. It's set in the Grand Rue, which was the first actual street of Geneva, because in Roman times, the Grand Rue was the rue linking the bridge, the Roman bridge, to the old city, which was on the hill. And the Société de Lecture is housed in what was the residence of the French resident of the French court. So its more recent history dates back to 1679, when Louis XIV decided that he needed to have somebody, not an ambassador, the resident is a little less important than an ambassador, but somebody in Geneva to check out a little bit what the Huguenots were doing, because he was not very happy about it. And, Protestants had a rough time in France since 1572. And so he needed to have some ears in Geneva. So he appointed a resident who came in what was already the Rome of Protestantism with a chaplain, because came with his, with his duty, he had the right to come with a chaplain. And so they needed a chapel. And it was a problem because, the Protestants around here were not happy at all to have to cope with a Catholic envoy.
So for people who are less familiar with that kind of history of Geneva, Geneva had become, because of Calvin, as you say, the Protestant Rome, so the center of the Protestant church.
Exactly.
And also a magnet for Protestants who were persecuted in other countries, particularly France and
Italy earlier.
And Catholics weren't allowed to worship in a Catholic way.
Yeah, they were, they were not. It was a very particular city because the first wave of Protestant immigrants came from Italy, from northern Italy, from Lucca, northern Tuscany. Those families came with money. They were merchants, they were bankers, they were prominent people. And so 100 years later, when they appointed the resident here, it was already very much a Protestant stronghold. And there were some very, very big tensions between France, who at the time was the most powerful country in Europe, and the Protestant world. They came from France, they wanted a big residence, they wanted a chapel, they wanted all sorts of things that were not in line at all with their surroundings. And on the other hand, the resident had a permanent seat in the cathedral here. He could come to Mass, etc. So it's very much, the birth of the place as a place, but it was not the Société de Lecture. And then in 1818, the Société de Lecture became a Société de Lecture. The houses changed hands. And then 5 or 6 prominent gentlemen who were mainly scientists, patrician families, who all had their own libraries, decided to mutualize or put together parts of their collections and have a place where you could. Actually, it was pretty modern. They wanted the newspapers from all of Europe to be accessible, and it was one of their first thing. And at the time, paper was expensive, everything was complicated. So they said, okay, people can come here and read the newspapers from as far as possible. And the nucleus of the library was actually bits and pieces of their own libraries. Some brought science books, some brought law books. And so at the time, the society was a very small club of actually very smart people. And so that was the idea. And very quickly, let's say in less than 100 years, the library counted 130,000 books, which was at the time quite substantial. And actually, when Lenin in 1904 was in Geneva, the size of the Société de Lecture was approximately 300 members, 330 members, and 130,000 books.
So it's just kind of a gentleman's club, but a very intellectual.
Exactly. It was an intellectual club.
I've got a biography of Lenin here by Robert Payne. I think it's from the 1960s. And it mentions several times the Société de Lecture. It says, he was delighted by the Société de Lecture in Geneva, a private library where the reader was charged a small fee. Here Lenin could take down books from the shelves and write at a table, which from long usage came to be known as Mr. Ulyanov's table. So he had his own table.
He had his own table. And what he liked about it, as compared to the bibliothèque publique and universitaire, because the university, Geneva always had a tradition of welcoming migrants, especially political migrants. Geneva had a long-standing relationship with Greece, for instance. At the time of the independence of Greece, there were lots of people who welcomed all sorts of Russian revolutionaries. It was even before, 1904 was 13 years before it actually happened, the revolution, but there were lots of Russians here, and they tend to gather around professors or the deans at the university. And what Lenin didn't like, from what I understand, is that he was always pestered by other members of the Russian community coming to talk to him about this and that, and we should do this, and you should organize that. And so he didn't find it a quiet place to work. He liked actually the privacy of a club. to be quiet and not to be bothered. At the time, as he said, his wife says in what she wrote about him living with Lenin, My Life with Lenin, she said this society had very few visitors and there were hardly any old professors sitting around. So I think he felt good here. And actually, lots of people felt good here. Here I have a long list of famous people who were members, Pierre de Coubertin, for instance, Franz Liszt. Lots of people became members, Rodolphe Töpfer, whom you mentioned before. So people all came for the same thing. It was a certain mind-opening place. There were lots of influence, even though it was very... let's say it was very conservative at the beginning. All these people, they were from patrician families, they were from big families, but they all had an edge. Either they liked botanic or science, and so it was always a city that was very, very much open.
We were across the street from Rousseau's birthplace as well.
Yes, exactly.
Who, I guess he wasn't from a patrician family. Were they watchmakers, I think, his parents?
Yeah.
But someone a great intellectual became, but also someone with definitely an edge.
Absolutely, definitely an edge. And that was always the case in Geneva. You have enlightened patriarchal and important families who helped also other people from lesser backgrounds, from lower birth for sure, to become who they became. That is, intellectuals, painters, physicians. It was always, and that's something that not everybody can appreciate from the outside, because Geneva can be at times a little stern and have a little bit that Calvinist edge and that history that we like, like everybody who has a long history likes to brag a little bit about it. So we play around a little bit, that sort of no-nonsense, stingy, thing about Calvin. But it's interesting because Calvinism is very, very far from communism and very far from any kind of Marxism. It's basically, it was a very, very harsh state. When Calvin was alive, it was not fun to live here. It was very, very hard. But then, with the siècle des Lumières and Voltaire and Rousseau, then suddenly, and Madame de Staël, then suddenly the place became much more open.
So much history, so many books and places mentioned there. John Calvin, who gave his name to the puritanical form of Protestant Christianity here in Geneva in the 1500s. Manuel mentioned Enlightenment thinkers Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born literally across the road from the Société de Lecture in the 1700s. We were on the island named after him earlier in this episode. And Voltaire, another Enlightenment writer-philosopher, whose important connections with Geneva we discovered in episode 3 of this podcast series. Also, Madame de Staël, who had a famous intellectual salon near Geneva after the French Revolution. All people whose thinking helped forge the soul and personality of this city. After learning some of the history of the Société de Lecture, I took a look around to see where Lenin might have plotted his own 20th century revolution.
And in this room, that's where, from what we know, Lenin used to like to sit. It's now called the Blue Room. But it was a room where there was a huge globe. It was probably much more a geographic looking feeling. Now the thing has been redone through the years. I think we miss a globe somewhere here.
Yeah.
In a society like that, we should have one.
So if this was the room, I'm just going to read a little bit from this biography. Every morning he came to the Société de Lecture with the punctuality of clockwork. a small, slight man who wore his trousers rolled in the Swiss fashion. Do you know what the Swiss fashion is?
I wouldn't know.
Okay, well, that's how he wore his trousers. Always patting his bald head before he sat down at his table beside the window. There are lots of windows in here,
Yes.
so one of them. A creature of habit, methodical, accurate, orderly in all his movements, the papers arranged neatly on the table, his chair at exactly the right angle to the window, as he plunged into a course of nightmarish reading on murder and assassination, and all the tumultuous details of armed revolt. So we've just walked up the stairs and we've met Maxime, who's the chief librarian, who's leading us through.
So this is what we call the compactus. It's actually where the rare books are stored. Because in our library that counts approximately over 200,000 books today, some of them need, like, as you know, some special care in terms of humidity, in terms of temperature. And so we keep the rare books here or the very old ones here. And we have a special affection for what Maxime is taking out now.
People listening to this will hear the air conditioning in the background. Maxime's opening up a book in French called Histoire des origines, vie de Jésus, The Life of Jesus, by Ernest Renan, printed in Paris in 1863. So this book would have been here probably since then. I guess it was bought new. There's lots of stamps there when it's been taken out, borrowed over the years. Could one of you tell me what the book is? It's as I understand it, it's a secular biography of the real person of Jesus rather than a spiritual.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in it there's a lot of pencil marks. I'm looking at page 127 and it's underlined. And there are some marks in the margin. Okay, I'm going to try and read. I could read the...
I can read it.
Okay.
So it's the life of Jesus, and they say, il veut anéantir la richesse et le pouvoir, mais non s'en emparer. So he says he wants to get rid of all the riches and the power, but not grab it.
Right.
And there is a small annotation in the corner that has been made by Lenin, who says, comme le
socialisme moderne.
Comme le socialisme moderne, like the modern socialism.
Right.
So we love this annotation because he used to, I think he wrote in many of the books he was reading, but I think it's the only one we have with his handwriting.
So is this book saying that non s'en emparer, not grabbing the power and the riches?
Exactly.
Destroy
them, but not grab them.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Have you have any more in this one?
He underlines some...
Yes, this is very interesting because Jésus, I get a French speaker to...
Ce qui distingue en effet Jésus des agitateurs de son temps et de ceux de tous les siècles, c'est son parfait idéalisme. Jésus, à quelques égards, est un anarchiste car il n'a aucune idée du gouvernement civil. So he says what distinguishes Jesus from the other agitators of all times is his perfect idealism and the fact that Jesus doesn't know anything about civil government makes him an anarchist.
Right.
And Lenin underlined it twice.
Yeah, so other bits are underlined, but the one word anarchist is underlined twice. Okay, so taking inspiration or learning from history.
Happy to see that, in the life of Jesus, there were some of the ingredients of what he was trying to promote at the time.
Right.
I don't know. When was that, Maxime? You think he...
1904.
1904.
So what became of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov after his years under Western eyes? He was still in Switzerland when popular unrest forced the abdication of the Tsar in 1917, and Lenin then returned to Russia. Let's hear once more from writer Serge Hazanov.
It is a very famous and mysterious story because the documents are still kept secret. The facts are that Germans wanted to send Russian revolutionaries to Russia to make Russian Empire weaker from inside.
This was during the Great War, the First World War.
It was 1917.
Right.
1917, right. So, and German headquarters approved this idea, got money, and finally Lenin and a group of other revolutionaries, they were put in a closed train, it was hermetic train, which crossed to Russia from Zurich, from Germany, but this train was really closed. They didn't have a right to get out. Right, it was special train, and then they arrived in the Petrograd. At the time it was called Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and there Lenin again took the reins and started the wheels of the revolution together with the Trotsky. Now, many historians claim that Lenin was bought for German money. But we don't have any facts, historical facts, confirming it. Certainly it was in the interest both of Germany and of Lenin.
The rest, I suppose, is history. There was civil war, strife and terror. Lenin died in 1924, aged just 53. I'll pass no comment on his place in the history of Russia, Geneva or the wider world. I'll just leave the final word to Joseph Conrad in this passage from Under Western Eyes, in which the book's narrator, a taciturn Englishman abroad, says this. In a real revolution, not a simple dynastic change or a mere reform of institutions, in a real revolution, the best characters do not come to the front. A violent revolution falls into the hands of narrow-minded fanatics and of tyrannical hypocrites at first. Afterwards comes the turn of all the pretentious intellectual failures of the time. Such are the chiefs and the leaders. You will notice that I've left out the mere rogues. The scrupulous and the just, the noble, humane and devoted natures, the unselfish and the intelligent may begin a movement, but it passes away from them. They are not the leaders of a revolution. They're its victims, the victims of disgust, of disenchantment, often of remorse. Hopes grotesquely betrayed, ideals caricatured, that is the definition of revolutionary success. There have been in every revolution hearts broken by such successes. The book was Under Western Eyes by Joseph Conrad. The place was the Société de Lecture in Geneva. For a list of all the other books and places mentioned in this episode, please head to the website abookaplace.com, which lists all the sources used. To see a version of this episode with pictures, head to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@abookaplace. I owe thanks to Serge Hazanov and to the Société de Lecture. The incidental music in this episode was taken from The Firebird, composed by Igor Stravinsky and first performed in 1910. Their closing theme is by Far. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating wherever you're listening to this, and do tell your friends about it. Anyone who likes books or history or travel, that's who I'm making these shows for. There's one more episode left in season 1, and here's a taster.
The Large Hadron Collider is one of the wonders of the modern world.
There is a tunnel so big it would take you nearly 6 hours to walk around.
Scientists have already made a major discovery, the Higgs boson. Some call it the God particle.
Science fiction? No, science fact. But CERN in Geneva did inspire author Dan Brown to make it the place to begin his Da Vinci Code series of novels. On A Book of Place Geneva, we go to CERN to discover a generation of scientists inspired by the fiction to make cutting-edge science fact.
I read the book. It had a story about antimatter, matter. I was so impressed that I thought, oh, maybe this is what I want to do in my future.
And we talked to a new generation of writers who, like Dan Brown, were inspired by CERN to create fiction.
It's like all your science fiction film fantasies coming true around you.
Part book club, part travel guide, part history podcast. A Book of Place Geneva takes you to the stories behind the stories. Don't miss this episode on the impact of Dan Brown's Angels and Demons. Listen wherever you get podcasts or visit abookaplace.com.